Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at the gubernatorial election in 2026 in the state of Connecticut. This is a state that we haven't covered too much on this channel, as it's typically a pretty blue state, but we got some news yesterday that makes me think that it might be worth taking a visit to Connecticut to talk about their election next year, at least for one video. In case you missed it, State Senator Ryan Fazio jumped into the race for governor. If you don't know who Ryan Fazio is, that's okay. We're going to talk in this video about who he is and why I think he's a really good candidate for Republicans. And we're also going to talk a little bit about, we're going to take this as an opportunity to talk a little bit about Connecticut as a whole, because, like I said, we don't talk about Connecticut too much. So getting into it, Connecticut has a gubernatorial race in 2026. In 2022, the last time this seat was up, Democrats won pretty decisively. Ned Lamont beat Bob Stefanowski by around 13 points. This was a bigger than expected margin of victory for Lamont because in 2018, he only won by around 3%. Now, we're going to start in 2018 because I think that's the most, that's kind of where our story begins here, as this is Ned Lamont's first run for governor. This was a very interesting election, mostly because even though Ned Lamont was a fine candidate on paper, Bob Stefanowski ran a pretty effective campaign for the GOP, and the broader theme of that election was the unpopularity of the outgoing Democratic governor, Dan Malloy. Now, Dan Malloy had one of the lowest approval ratings of any governor in the country when he was leaving office in 2018. He was a Democrat, and that really hurt the Democratic brand locally, not as much federally, but locally in elections in Connecticut. That harmed them in the state legislature, especially in years like 2014 and 2016. And it also, as you can see in this race for governor, really didn't help. It really didn't do them any favors. Lamont only won by 3. And you can really see that as Democrats, or as time has shifted away from that era of Democratic politics in Connecticut, Democrats have kind of regained trust. And Ned Lamont, again, won by 13 points against Bob Stefanowski, and who's the same opponent. So clearly, there were a fair amount of Democrats who defected, didn't vote for Lamont in 2018, but, gave him 4 years to differentiate himself and voted for him in 2022. And so Democrats have been pretty, I shouldn't say Democrats, but Lamont, at least we know, has been pretty popular. He has approval ratings in the 60s, which is quite good. He's a more moderate governor. He's not super progressive, especially given that he's in a pretty blue state. So he's going to face a primary challenger from the left, but he's very likely to win that primary. And assuming he does run again, which at this point does seem likely, although not guaranteed, he'll be the Democratic nominee, and he'll be in a pretty good position heading into the general election because he is overall a popular governor. So if that's the case, and if 2026 is a year where Trump is in office and where Democrats, argue that they have a lot of upside in terms of building up a good national environment, I'm not sure if that's the case, but at least Democrats will, have argued that. And that is typically the rule of thumb in midterms. So if all of that is true, why is this race worth discussing? Well, Republicans have landed Ryan Fazio, who, like I said, is a state senator, to run. And from an electability standpoint, Fazio is one of the strongest Republicans in Connecticut. And we can kind of, learn about this by looking into Connecticut. So Fazio, state senator from the 36th district, which stretches from all of Greenwich to North Stamford, which is the more suburban part of Stamford. Downtown Stamford's obviously more urban, and then New Canaan. So he's from an area that, as you can see federally, is pretty blue. Kamala Harris won the 36th Senate district by around 17%, and Biden won it by 25%. So it's a blue area federally. But if you know anything about Greenwich and New Canaan and Fairfield County in general, you'll know that back in 2012, it was a different story. Mitt Romney did very well, especially in Greenwich and New Canaan, as well as to an extent North Stamford. Back in 2012, he won the district. And even in 2018, which was the last time we had a truly competitive statewide election in Connecticut, Bob Stefanowski carried the seat by around 5%. So this seat is pretty swingy. It has been pretty favorable to Democrats in the Trump era. As it's the typical affluent, pretty educated suburban area that has moved to the left. In the Trump era, and so federally, especially in presidential and Senate elections, it's been pretty blue. But Republicans have kind of held their ground locally to an extent, although they're losing power. That's definitely true. But the thing about Fazio that's interesting is that he's been able to win this state Senate district 3 times since 2021. And we're going to look at the 2018 election here because this is the first time it flipped blue. And you can see, this is a really interesting pattern that we're observing that I think is relevant to Connecticut as a whole. So this district, again, these are the suburbs. It's Romney territory, then went to Clinton, then Biden, then obviously in 2024 Harris. Democrats flipped the seat by a point and a half in 2018 midterms, benefited likely from a pretty blue national environment, but nonetheless, Alex Kasser won this seat, even though it did vote for Bob Stefanowski in the governor's race. The Democrats flipped it. And then in 2020, this is where Fazio comes on the scene. Alex Kasser, the incumbent, won re-election, but she won by less than 3% as an incumbent in a Biden plus 25 seat. So we can already see Fazio ran a pretty strong campaign this year. He outran Trump by a sizable amount, and that's definitely something interesting to note. And then if you go to 2022, in that same district, it was redrawn, but obviously, the district was essentially the same. We saw a very close race. It was decided by just 89 votes. And this came, actually, there's some context here. In 2021, Alex Kasser, the Democrat, resigned from the seat. There was a special election which Fazio won by around 2 or 3% to flip the seat red. And then Fazio, who's the incumbent at this point, even though he'd lost 2020, he was the incumbent because he'd won the special next year. He won a very, very narrow race. And this was, again, in a seat that Ned Lamont carried comfortably against Bob Stefanowski in 2022. So Fazio, again, had to outrun the top of the ticket by a pretty substantial amount. And then in 2024, which I think is probably the most impressive result we've got here, Fazio won by his largest margin yet in a year where Kamala Harris won the seat by 17 points, which was, to be fair, it was less than what Biden had done in 2020. But Democrats, this was a race that Democrats really, really competed in. In 2022, there was the argument, Democrats didn't really contest Fazio to the extent that they could have. In 2024, Nick Simmons was viewed as a pretty strong candidate. Democrats really wanted to win this race, and they ended up losing it by around 2,000 votes, which might not sound like a lot, but that's a full 3.5 points in these small New England legislative districts. So overall, what you're looking at is a pretty skilled campaigner and a pretty good politician in an area that has really drifted away from the Democratic or from the Republican Party at all levels of government. Now, obviously, at the top of the ticket, these towns are pretty blue, and they get less blue the further down the ticket you go, right? Like, the Republicans are a lot more competitive in the state legislative elections. Nonetheless, it's still different than it was in 2014 or 2012, right? Like, there was a time where this was a safe Republican district locally. And then there's also the fact of the matter, which is that Democrats now need to compete here to win majorities in the legislature. So Democrats, now need, this is part of their coalition, they now need to win in areas like Greenwich and North Stamford and New Canaan to do well federally, or not federally, but to do well, I would say, like, as a whole in the legislature. And so Fazio running for governor makes this race really interesting because Democrats are going to have to do a couple of things. First of all, they're going to have to shore up a little bit their support in these areas, right? Fairfield County, this is the most populous county in Connecticut. It's these towns over here. It's been pretty blue for the past few cycles. And in 2022, Ned Lamont didn't really have to worry too much about Fairfield County. It was quite solid for him, especially relative to 2018. But if we do get a Lamont versus Fazio matchup, what we're going to have to look at is can Fazio win over Lamont voters from 2022 or Harris voters from 2024? Can he win over these voters in these towns? And it goes beyond Greenwich and New Canaan. It also goes into towns further up here, kind of that have also shifted to the left or in recent presidential elections. And so that's a pretty vote-rich area. Democrats have been doing really well here for the past couple of cycles. And overall, I would definitely argue that the Republicans have a chance to improve here, and it's going to come from running on what Fazio has been able to run in the past, which is mostly cost of living, taxes, especially electricity bills. Right, as someone who knows the politics of this area quite well, right, like. Ryan Fazio based his whole, not only his campaign, but his whole personality in the state Senate as, fighting to lower the cost of electricity for homeowners in Connecticut. And so this is a really hard. I don't want to say hard, but it's definitely a unique challenge that was not presented by Stefanowski in 2022 for Lamont in 2026. So overall, a really interesting development that I think has the potential to make a competitive race, but also Lamont's a popular governor, and Democrats could, I'm not saying will at this point, because I don't think that there's a great argument for this, but Democrats might still end up having a pretty good 2026 if Trump gets more unpopular and if Democrats can recover their favorability rating a little bit among the voters. But that's a conversation for another time. Um, like another quick note that I want to make is that it's also not a guarantee Fosco wins the Republican primary. He isn't. I would, he's definitely not a moderate Republican. He's definitely not someone like Charlie Baker or Phil Scott. But he's also not the most right wing Republican. He isn't right. Talk about like Republicans that are running in 2026. He's not someone like, or I don't know, he isn't like a Doug Mastriano type. I guess is the best way I can put it. He isn't, going to align himself with Trump too closely, even though he's definitely not super moderate either. But the issue for him is that he might not win the primary if Connecticut, or if we get a more kind of MAGA associated GOP candidate in the field. But I think he'd probably start out as a narrow favorite just because he comes from, like, of all the candidates in the field at this point, he comes from the most populous and like electorally relevant area of the state. And then another cool thing is that and this is not an endorsement, but if he were to win, he would be the second statewide elected official that off the top of my head, that I've met in person. So that's not an endorsement, though. Unfortunately, we don't do endorsements on this channel. But anyways, let me know what you think. Always happy to talk Connecticut politics. I think this is a really interesting state politically. And please comment down suggestions below for videos in the future.